and welcome back to our second half of our first day of gridXdays. If you've been with us since the morning, I hope you've enjoyed the really insightful discussions we've had thus far. And if you're just joining us now, I hope you're ready for some more educational chats. Just to remind everybody who is watching, we do have a live Q&A going on, so please add your questions for the panelists and we will read them out for them. We are now on to our next panel. Are we in a PV and EV slump? Joining us, we have four panelists. First, introduce you to Jan Rosenow. Jan is the Vice President and European Program Director at the Regulatory Assistance Project, a nonprofit focused on clean energy. He founded his first environmental group when he was 8 and now advises governments, international organizations, and businesses on energy and climate issues. He is also an active researcher and affiliated with universities such as Oxford and Cambridge. He is recognized globally as a top climate influencer and drives sustainable energy solutions. Joining him, we also have Dr. Torsten Brammer. Dr. Brammer has over 25 years of experience in solar energy. He has contributed to the industry as a key player at Q-Cells and Senec, where he helped advance solar cell production and storage technology. In 2011, he co-founded WAVELABS, a global leader in LED-based solar simulators, and he is also the creator and host of the podcast, The Solar Journey. Dr. Brammer, maybe you can give me some podcasting tips later for GridX's own podcasts.
You're welcome, sure.
And then we also have Georgia Saliba. George is the project manager at Apricum, the Cleantech advisory based in Paris, specializing in renewable energy, conventional power, and EV charging infrastructure. He brings extensive experience in strategy development, M&A, and project management, and previously held senior roles at Arthur D. Litter and Accenture Strategy. He helps clients in accelerating the renewable energy transition through strategic insights and innovative solutions. And then finally, finishing off our panelists is Maria Linkova-Nijs. Maria is the executive head of policy and strategy at ACEA, with over 15 years of experience in data-driven public affairs and policy communications. She co-led a team of nearly 30 before joining ACEA earlier this year, leveraging innovative channels and tools such as machine learning and artificial intelligence. At ACEA, Maria leads the policy and strategy department, playing a key role in enhancing the industry's position in policy discussions and aligning ACEA's strategic activities. So thank you, everyone, for joining for this panel. We will start it off with a question to Jan. So Jan, over the past 5 years, annual solar capacity additions quadrupled to 425 gigawatts, but annual manufacturing capacity is set for a six-fold increase to more than 1,100 gigawatts, a level that, if deployed in full, would be very close to the amounts needed in the net zero scenario. Yet reports from as recently as this summer indicated that PV sales are declining. And likewise, the sale of EVs is climbing at a much slower rate than in the past years, and it looks almost as if the boom of sales is over. Would you agree with this? And if so, would you say this is a slowdown in adoption, in production, or both?
Hi, everyone. I would not agree that it's a slump, and that's for various reasons. First of all, since the summer, the numbers have picked up again. So when you look at more recent data, you will see an increase compared to where we were, for example, in August and in September in particular. What we also find is that there are certain cycles to how many EVs in particular get sold related to policy targets. So in Europe, but also in the UK, car manufacturers have to sell an increasing share of electric vehicles over a certain time period. And once they hit that target, what we find is that EV sales come down a bit, but then when they get close to having to deliver on a new target again, and they haven't met it, sales go up. That's exactly what we're seeing right now in the UK. Just yesterday, I saw a report in the Times saying that the car prices for electric vehicles would be slashed by up to a third because the manufacturers are now under pressure to deliver on those targets, and that will increase sales in return. So I think we just have to be careful in misinterpreting some of the data that we're seeing. Some of it is short term, but the long term trends for EVs are actually upwards. What we have seen is a slowdown in the growth rate. So we have seen an expansion that was faster in previous years than this year. But overall, we're still selling more EVs than we used to sell last year. So that's important, I think, to differentiate. The total numbers are up. The growth rate that we've seen is slowing down a bit, but that's not so unexpected because we would expect at some point that growth will come down a bit. What we don't want to see is the total numbers to drop. On solar, again, if you look at more recent data, you actually see an expansion of the market rather than a decline. So I think we should look at the long-term data across the entire year. That'll be more useful than looking at what happened in September. And some of the media reports there, I think, are just picking a single number from a single month. It'll be much more useful, I think, to look at the entire year. And that looks actually quite positive. Also looked at Germany this morning in preparation for this, and you can see that the numbers are up again in October. So I wouldn't be too negative about the dips we've seen in some months. Maybe I stop here and let the others come in if they want to on this question as well, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, does anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Torsten. So Jan, I totally share your view. I think we need to look at longer periods of time for a thorough analysis. And yes, particularly solar has been growing for the last 2 to 3 decades, and it keeps growing, right? With growth rates of around 20-30%. And as I mentioned, for the last 2 decades. So any industry with such a high growth rate over such a long time is super healthy, and small variations from month to month or quarter to quarter don't give you the real picture.
And actually, our next question then is for Maria. Maria, in your opinion, what is the best way to measure the success of EV markets? Can the different ways of measuring EV markets lead to distortion, hype, or confusion in market trends?
Yeah, so thank you. And actually, I would like to come back to maybe one of the points that also Jan made. And it's good to see a lot of optimism that this is just a short-term dip in the sales of electric vehicles and things will rebound quickly. But if we also look at the data, I mean, between beginning of 2024 and October, what we see at the moment is continuous stagnation. So there's if we look at the data, we are now at about 13% of the market share compared to almost 15% last year. So the numbers do go down, or at least they are not growing. And whilst, of course, we did some forecasts say the manufacturers will reduce prices, will launch new models to indeed increase the sales. I think the underlying situation is really concerning because if we're even, we're almost in 2025 and we're still struggling to grow the market for electric vehicles to 15%, how are we going to go from here to 100% of new registrations being zero emission in 2035? So that's a little bit of this, I think, the disconnect between the let's say the expectations and the forecast and the current market situation that sends a really worrying signal for European manufacturers, but also for policymakers, because now we're looking at potential risks to the success of the whole road transport decarbonization policy. And also we see that it's not just the manufacturers saying this. So S&P Global, they're about to publish a revised forecast for next year, and so they're going to revise it from, I think, about 27% of the market share that they predicted early this year to much lower figure. Much lower figure considering the current market developments. And that's also the picture is consistent across all brands, and it's not just, you can say, a problem for European manufacturers, but also Chinese, American ones. And that, of course, brings us to, I think, a very important point in a discussion about enabling conditions. So really to create conditions for consumers to choose EVs. And we see that in a lot of countries, this is not the case yet. But I'm sure we'll talk about it later also in this podcast.
Nice. And now going to George, how have different countries' approaches to subsidies for EVs influenced the current market trajectories? Do you think governments are pulling back too soon?
Yes, I think it's an interesting question. And to echo Jan's and Maria's inputs, I think when you think about the energy transition as a whole and the EV transition in particular, it's kind of a combination between a long-term play. So you have to look at the long-term trends. But it's also important to be mindful that the short-term disruptions might actually delay it. They're not going to derail it. They're going to delay it. And I think this is where the point on subsidies becomes quite relevant. So when you think about subsidies, I think it's important to distinguish between those supply-side subsidies, the ones that target, say, the likes of Tesla, who are looking to establish their next gigafactory, and they're very crucial in adding manufacturing capacity. But also, more importantly, in my sense, are the demand-side subsidies, those that target consumers and that create favorable conditions, as Maria said, for the uptake of mobility. And these are fundamental because simply they create a market and they make that market much more responsive to the available products. And in that sense, when you look at the growth curves and the growth trajectory of EV in the past, the double-digit, triple-digit growth figures that we've seen can be directly correlated to those subsidies. And the question becomes, what happens when we end those subsidies? And make no mistake, those subsidies at some point will cease to exist if the energy transition is to become a success. It needs to be able to stand on its own. The question is how fast and how do we actually approach the end of those subsidies. And an interesting case study, I think, comes from Germany, which in end of 2023, if I'm not mistaken, beginning of 2024, pulled out some of those subsidies. We've seen a dip in the summertime, upwards of 30-40%, I believe, and a drop of sales. That can be attributed to different factors. Of course, there's inflationary context, but subsidies clearly played a major role there. And to me, this tells us two things. One is the market has not weaned itself out of subsidies. It would be quite a dangerous assumption to make on the part of policymakers. And the second thing, when you end those subsidies quite brutally, the shockwaves will be felt in the sales cycle. So the message here to policymakers is any end of those subsidies needs to take a long-term view, and it needs to provide visibility to automakers to allow them to adjust their pricing strategies accordingly, and also to take a long-term view as to what their economics should be, their unit cost economics should be. And I think this is really fundamental here.
And then, Torsten, what about the subsidies for solar?
Yeah, I'd say in most developed economies, solar doesn't require subsidies anymore. I think what it really requires is the real conditions for growth. You all know that the International Energy Agency in 2020 said that for projects with low-cost financing, solar PV is now the cheapest source of electricity in history. And the market this year is likely going to be something like 600 gigawatts of installations globally. And this is really a remarkable figure, right? Up by roughly 30% from last year. And as I mentioned earlier, the industry has been growing like that for the last 20 to 30 decades, 2 to 3 decades. But there are, of course, some headwinds which are reducing the acceleration of solar deployment. In many countries, there's slow project approval. There are limits to grid access, and there's now, particularly in countries where there's lots of solar and wind, there's price cannibalization. So where policies and not subsidies play an important role. So and changes on the regulatory level can play a role in accelerating battery and with that solar uptake, because batteries would reduce the price cannibalization. For example, South Australia is a remarkable example for this, where lots of wind and solar and now large batteries now are applied in combination with strengthening the grid. In general, I would say I personally would prefer a regulatory framework which accelerates uptake of solar, wind, and batteries without subsidies, but with a fast lane for renewables, and in turn actually stop subsidies for coal, oil, gas, and nuclear power, right? And then each energy source should carry its own burden of its own long-term effects on Earth, so that we enter the age of a sustainable life. And I think Hannah Ritchie put it beautifully in her book. We can be the first generation in the history of mankind to achieve that with the technology we have already developed.
Interesting. And actually, going off of you bringing up the regulatory measures, this question is for Jan. In your opinion, how can local governments better support the PV and EV sectors, especially in areas where grid infrastructure is outdated or weak?
I mean, in general, local governments don't have a lot of say over grid infrastructure, right? This is usually a matter for national regulators, NRAs, and the distribution grid operators. Yes, it's true that in some countries, like the Netherlands, for example, there are grid constraints, but they're not yet a big problem for EV chargers and small-scale rooftop solar in quite the same way as they are a problem for much larger loads connected to the medium and high voltage grid. That's what we're seeing in the Netherlands. I think there are other things local governments can do outside of helping with grid constraints, because that's not really an area where local governments have a lot of sway over the grid companies that are regulated by national regulators. And that is more to do with things like planning and also off-street and on-street charging. So a lot of people don't have off-street charging, right? They don't have a driveway and they need to connect to a charge point, and ideally that would maybe be a private charge point, so they can benefit from lower electricity rates. Maybe they are on a time of use tariff, on a time dynamic tariff, and in order for them to be able to connect, there are some quite innovative solutions. So I live in a city, I live in Oxford, where we have a lot of terraced houses, and one of the ways of charging on street would be to actually be able to have a wire that is going across the pavement. And what the city of Oxford allows you to do is they would actually cut let me call it a channel for the cable into the pavement, where you can pull your cable through, so you're not obstructing anything, and you can charge your car. So I'm using that. I've used that for the last 4 years or so successfully, and several other people on the street have the same system in place. Very simple, practical step that can enable people to have access to charging from their own home rather than having to use public chargers. But of course, the other, when it comes to EVs, the other point is public charging infrastructure. And that's where cities have a huge role to play, because they are often in charge of deciding where those charge points will go. Whether that's a public car park or whether they use old lamp posts, which already have electricity in them, to make public charging available. So that's key. I think when it comes to PV, again, the kind of boundary conditions are usually set by national governments, right? But there are things like planning and making it easy for people to install PV. That's an area where cities do have more power and can actually make it easier or more difficult to install PV panels. And also for new developments, in some countries, it's already mandatory for new buildings to have solar installed, but not in all. And local governments can, again, set certain conditions So that's, I think, an area where local government certainly can play an important role. But I'm not persuaded they will help us with the grid issues. I think that's a matter for the regulator and for the grid companies.
Actually, just kind of going off of that, because this came up in a podcast episode of ours, do you think then that local governments have even more of a challenge because the majority of Europe does live in apartment buildings, like versus standalone houses?
Yes, and in some cases, these buildings are actually owned or operated by municipalities. Right? There's often a link, social housing in particular. So no, yes, I think there is definitely an opportunity for cities to particularly play a role when it comes to apartment buildings and people renting, because when you're renting, you have even less choice to make interventions in the building that you're living in.
Yeah. So actually sticking with the EV topic specifically, Maria, do you think consumer attitudes are shifting away from electric vehicles, or is demand still growing despite the potential market challenges? I know we said that it did dip a bit in September, but that we shouldn't just look at those numbers.
Yeah, so I don't think that it's fair to say that people are moving away from electric vehicles. I mean, who probably most of the consumers who drive electric, they say that they don't want to come back to internal combustion engine. That said, the enabling conditions that really make this type of vehicles attractive for a lot of consumers are not met en masse. And I mean, we already talked about infrastructure here. The fact is that 60% of all infrastructure in the EU is located in only 3 countries: France, Germany, the Netherlands. So if you're a consumer based elsewhere, you will have, let's say, harder time finding public infrastructure. And that also is closely linked to the problem not just of availability of infrastructure, but also accessibility. Because a typical driver of electric vehicle is now somebody who lives in a detached house, so somebody who has access to private charging. But as we already discussed, we also need to think about how do we make electric mobility attractive for city dwellers, because more than 50% of households in the EU, these are the people that live in an apartment block. They don't live in a separate house. So they will rely on public infrastructure to charge their vehicles. And this is why the role of governments or local authorities in rolling out infrastructure is extremely important. But also the prices of electricity. Again, here, somebody who drives electric and has to charge publicly is at disadvantage, because the electricity prices when you use public charging are higher than if you were to charge your vehicle at home. So these are all the things that obviously they carry a lot of weight for consumers. And if we are really to accelerate this transition, so to reduce the cost of ownership for electric vehicles, infrastructure, the prices of electricity, these are some things that we absolutely need to look into and make them more attractive.
Okay. And then actually going off of that, Jan, do you see dynamic electricity tariffs as the driver or the barrier for PV and EV adoption?
I just saw that I think Torsten wanted to come back in on
Yes,
the
sorry.
previous point. Is that all right if I give him the floor first?
Yeah. Sorry. Small screen in front of me.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jan. Maria, maybe the question for Maria or Jan. So we talk about charging your electric vehicle in front of your apartment building, right? But is that really the right place? I mean, it's nice if it works, right? But somebody who owns a car, he would take the car to work or to the supermarket for shopping, right? Isn't that the real location, actually an easy location for install opportunities to fill your battery, right? What's your take?
From my perspective, and I think here we need to hear the perspective of consumers, really. I mean, this is also what we hear from our colleagues in the European Consumer Association. I mean, for this transition to work, it also has to be convenient for people, right? If you're going to make this really difficult, the pace will be slower because, as we know, people don't like changing their habits. So they want to have the convenience and ease of charging, wherever they live or indeed wherever they work. And the harder you make it for people to own an electric vehicle, obviously the slower the pace of transition will go. So I don't think it's a matter of where. It's about making this as available and as accessible as possible. And indeed, if there is an opportunity to charge at work or in the supermarket, it should be the option. But we also should not limit ourselves only to those locations. Again, to ease the consumer acceptance of EVs.
Just to add to that, I think especially when you have a garage for lots of vehicles underneath an apartment block, which is quite typical in larger cities now, that seems like a no-brainer to have charging opportunities on site. I think relying on people charging up while they're shopping, you would need a rapid charger, really. I mean, unless you do a really long shopping trip. But from my own experience, I drive an EV. I've driven one for the last 4 years. Yeah, if you stop by for 20 minutes somewhere to do your shopping and you charge it on a slow charger with 7 or maybe 11 or 22 kilowatts, you're not going to get anywhere near to a full charge. So at work makes a lot more sense. But I'd say on site or close to where people live is probably important for the reasons that Maria outlined. But on your question on dynamic tariffs and whether there would be an obstruction, a barrier, or an opportunity, I'm very much in the opportunity camp, and that's simply because you can save yourself an awful lot of money if you smart charge. So if you are on a time dynamic tariff, and that's a tariff for those in the audience who might not know exactly what that is. It's a tariff that will change very frequently, might be changing every 30 minutes, for example. And there are now some companies offering that. And it's often tied to the wholesale price of electricity and also network charges that might vary in some countries between, for example, night and day hours. So whilst it's a risk for people who are unable to shift their consumption or might want to use a lot of electricity during hours when it's very expensive, it's also a huge opportunity if you can schedule when you charge your vehicle. And that can be coupled with also the production of solar. So I have solar on my rooftop, for example, but I also have a time dynamic tariff. And you can optimize between using solar that's self-generated, so to maximize self-consumption and avoid grid imports, and cheap periods where electricity is really low cost, to charge your car at zero or even negative cost. That's what I sometimes do when it's particularly windy day. Electricity costs can go negative, and actually EVs can play a role in supporting the system, avoiding curtailment, and you get paid as an EV driver for that. So I think there's a huge opportunity for time dynamic tariffs rather than an obstruction. And I think what's important is that we mobilize that smart charging capability, and that can be fully automized, so people don't need to worry about their car not being charged or having to watch prices every half an hour. It can be completely automized with an algorithm.
Okay. And we have a question from the audience. I believe this would be to Maria or George. Do you think the additional use cases, such as V2G, V2H, that come with EVs might help to drive adoption as they are grid-friendly assets?
I'm happy to provide my views on that. And I think, when you think about the value of an electric vehicle, certainly cost is a factor. And we can talk about TCO and all of that, but also when you think about it from a revenue generating aspect, the key difference between EVs and thermal vehicles today, ICEVs as they're called, lies in their ability to integrate with the grid. And therefore to provide services to the grid. And I think V2G, vehicle to grid, for those who don't know, it's the ability of an electric vehicle to behave bidirectionally with the grid. So we talked about smart charging, which is the ability to defer charging perhaps to a time of day where prices are lower, but it could also be injecting or feeding electricity back into the grid when prices are convenient. And V2G is exiting. A couple of years ago, it was a little bit more speculative in nature. People were a little bit skeptical of whether it's going to take off. And when you look at what happened today, so in 2022 in France, the system operator RTE certifies V2G to provide frequency response to the grid. Look at what's happening today in the UK. You have Octopus Energy providing V2G tariffs. I think 2026 Nissan is going to introduce a V2G functionality. So there's certainly increasing momentum around it, and there's certainly increasing value around it. And strength is going to come from numbers. It doesn't take too many vehicles. You just need that critical mass, that critical threshold to be able to constitute viable flexibility pools, which can be aggregated via virtual power plants. And that's certainly going to play a major role going forward in stabilizing the grid and hence in increasing the values of electric vehicles.
And Maria, do you have anything to add with that?
Yeah, just very quickly, absolutely, yes, that there are opportunities, but there are a lot of questions that obviously arise when we talk about vehicle to grid. We already discussed one of them. So energy, electricity prices, dynamic prices, taxation of electricity. So we need to avoid double taxation when you charge and discharge the battery, but also impact on the battery life, for example. This is also an important aspect. If you continuously use it as energy storage, what will happen to the battery life? So all these aspects, they obviously need to be looked at, and so there may be some use cases for this, but probably not across the board. Because also next to passenger vehicles, which are indeed parked, you can say most of the time, you also have commercial vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles. And for them, they are continuously in use. Probably this whole idea of vehicle to grid is not that straightforward and is indeed more less attractive, I would say. So yes, opportunities are there, but I think we probably need to sort out all those aspects first before we can, with confidence, say that this is indeed the way forward.
Okay. And then, Jan, how important is interoperability between PV and EV systems in encouraging a broader market adoption? Are you seeing companies integrating these technologies effectively?
Not enough yet, I would say. There are now solution providers who will integrate, and not just EVs and PV, but also batteries, or maybe heat pumps, the whole suite of technologies someone might have in a home, and optimize across these technologies. But it's still quite segmented. The market is still too segmented in my view, where you have one company that deals with the PV installation, and one company deals with your EV charger, another one with the battery. Integrating it into a whole package does make sense. And we need to see more of that, because it really provides opportunities, I think, for people to make more of these technologies in combination. And I mentioned the example before, like charging when the sun is shining, reduces your costs as an EV owner, right? But you need a software that does that for you. I don't think we want people to worry about what is the solar production on a given day and then switch on. That doesn't make sense to me. I think it'll be much better if this is fully automized as much as it can be, and the owner of the EV just plugs in and gets the cheapest possible charge that makes the most of solar. So there are different ways of doing that. There's still a lot of work, I think, that needs to be done to fully integrate these technologies. Maybe just one final thought. I mean, often it might be the EV that's, I think Greg Jackson from Octopus, to come back to Octopus a second time, I think, in this conversation, he used the analogy of EVs being the gateway drug on a podcast recording I did with Greg a while back, which I think is very telling. I mean, it's basically often the first point at which customers might come into contact with many of the clean energy technologies. They drive an EV, and the next thing they might think about is, how do I actually charge that car? And then they might think about solar. And once they think about solar, maybe they think about a battery. And once they have that, they might think about a heat pump. So there's a whole chain of things where you can integrate different technologies. The EV is often the first one that people buy because it's kind of maybe the most interesting product out of them all. And I think we can use it as an opportunity to also integrate other technologies in the home.
That's a really good point about it being like the most interesting product of all of them. And so actually, Georges, that kind of takes me to you. What role does the cost of raw materials such as lithium for batteries, silicon for solar cells, what role does the cost of those play in the current state of the EV industry?
Yeah, I think I'll speak for EVs, but I think it's quite a similar equation when you extrapolate it to solar PV. The interesting thing about EVs, and this is in contrast to ICE EVs, is that when we think about the cost structure of a typical vehicle, and that will be subject to some statistical variance, of course, but typically you can expect about half of the cost to reside in the battery. And when you think about what's inside the battery, the cells and the components of the cells, lithium is going to be obviously the key material there, especially lithium-ion based technologies, which is what the mass market has converged upon, at least today. So mechanically, any changes to the price of the inputs is going to get reflected in the price tag of an electric vehicle in a way that's perhaps much more accentuated than is the case for again thermal vehicles. And especially when you add to that the fact that when you think about where lithium deposits are located today, I mean, it's a bit of a concentrated market. I mean, you do have quite a few in South America and Australia, et cetera, but it's compared to steel, for instance, it's quite concentrated. So it's a real topic, and not just from a cost perspective, but also from an energy security perspective. So whereas historically and even today, let's say oil used to be the key question to policymakers in terms of energy security, in the future, that's going to converge more and more towards those critical minerals and materials which fuel the energy transition, including lithium. And so the question is going to become about how do we develop strategies both at national level, corporate levels, of course, but also at national levels in order to make sure that the energy transition is sustained, that it's not being driven by the whims of supply chain disruptions and tariffs and things of that nature. I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion point going forward.
Nice. And for just my last question for the panel, looking ahead, are there any market disruptions or innovations that you guys are looking forward to that could help propel the growth or continue to propel the growth of PVs and EVs? Maybe start with Torsten.
Yeah, happy to answer for PV. I think there's been PV has gone through a massive learning curve. So 20 years ago, the price for PV was 100 times larger than today. And since then, it's been coming down dramatically. We are now at a cost level which we have never expected before, right? And which makes it such a cheap conversion device to create energy, to supply electricity. There's plenty of innovations ahead of us. The biggest is really the adoption, so the economies of scale, which is not really innovation, but tiny improvements here and there. One massive innovation which could come into the market is the so-called tandem solar cells. So right now we're using in commercial applications mainly a single solar cell, and the new type of solar cells could be two solar cells stacked on top of each other. So there's the first tiny commercial applications of these new devices. There's lots of activity worldwide, particularly in China, of course. It's not proven that it will work, particularly long-term reliability is a critical aspect, but it's happening, and this would allow us to manufacture modules with an efficiency above 30%. We are right now at 22-25%. So, and this will prove to happen in the next few years.
Nice. Maria and George, anything for the EV industry?
Well, maybe just a quick one. Obviously, the battery technology. I mean, that there's a lot of research and development, innovation, obviously going into that direction to create, even cheaper batteries with greater range. So hopefully, we'll see some breakthroughs over there. But I agree with what Torsten said. We're now. It's really not. I mean, the product is already there. The product is good. Now it's about really bringing this to the market and ensuring the mass adoption. So consumer incentives are key to further accelerate the rollout of both PVs and EVs.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't want to repeat, of course, what we just said. Otherwise, I'd be redundant. I completely agree with what was said. To add to it, I just think it's important to keep in mind that the energy transition is on. It's irreversible. It's important to keep in mind as we experience these cycles of bust and boom and political cycles and fiscal cycles and elections and all that. Sure, there will be some let's say tactical changes to deal with, but we're on a pretty bullish outlook here, and I think it's really about players growing more resilient, improving technology cost, and then policymakers being mindful that there's quite a little bit of enablement needed to accelerate that, especially that we're on a very tight timeline to 2050 and all the net zero ambitions. So it's very important that we sustain that policy support.
Nice. And Jan, any last thoughts to add to that before we wrap up?
Yeah, maybe just to come back to the theme we discussed at the beginning, are we in a slump of deployment? I was thinking the long-term view, when you sort of look back at where we were a decade ago, right? I mean, how many EVs were on the market, at what cost? How many people installed solar? What was total installed capacity globally? When you look at those numbers and you look at where we are today, what we find is that we've come an awful long way. I mean, few people would have deemed possible what we have seen happening. Still, there's a lot of challenges. There's no doubt. This is really difficult. It's hard. It's going to take time. But I think we can take some comfort in what we have already achieved over the last 10 years. And with innovation, I mean, just looking at the cost of batteries and the cost of PV modules, they're just going down. And you think like this is the end, right? They can't get any cheaper, and yet they're still getting cheaper. So I think there's still a lot of room for innovation. Efficiencies are improving, both of batteries and of PV modules. So in another decade, and we look back, I think, again, we will be surprised by how much progress we've made.
Nice. I think that's a great note to end on. It turns out we probably shouldn't have called this an EV PV slump, but just a very slow climb. So thank you to all of you for taking part in this panel today. And we will come right back with our next panel.